on the ILS, 25 left, slow window 180.
25 heavy, later runway 25 left, correction line number 2, following Company Heavy Airbus 3 mile farm.
Okay, number 2.
What's going on, guys? Flyby Simulations here, and welcome to the third episode in the full flight portion of this Aircrafts Dissected series, where we delve into every single switch, knob, and display in the flight deck of the Zibo mod Boeing 737-800. In the previous episode, we took a look at the electrical power-up procedure as well as the preliminary pre-flight procedure, where we established electrical power to the aircraft and prepared the IRS systems for alignment. In this episode, we're going to be taking a look at the control display unit located in front of the pilots to program the flight management computers in the flight. We will be taking a detailed look at how to program a route, configure takeoff and climb performance, and program our departure out of San Francisco and our arrival into Los Angeles. Now, one final note. Unfortunately, the Ken Air procedure checklist we used in the previous episode doesn't have detailed procedures for how to go about programming the FMC. Hence, I decided to go ahead and create my own procedure checklist. I'm pretty sure I will be uploading it to the explain.org forums, but nevertheless, that checklist will be linked down in the description for you guys to follow along with me. So, without further ado, let's jump into the flight deck. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the flight deck of the Boeing 737-800. As you can see, the aircraft is in the exact same state where we left off in the previous episode, with the main battery switched on, the GPU connected and supplying power, and the IRS mode selectors ready for alignment. Now, before we get started, let's do a couple of things that come later on in the Ken Air checklist, but I like to do now. Number 1 is to switch the strobe light up here to the steady position. If you remember from episode 1, this basically activates the green light on the left wing and the red light on the right wing and indicates to others near the aircraft that pilots are currently on board and are working. The next thing I like to do is to configure a few lights within the cockpit. So let's start off at the top and work our way down. Starting at the aft overhead panel, I like to switch the main dome light to the dim mode. Coming further down to the forward overhead panel, you may adjust the panel backlighting as you please. You can also do the same on the forward panels, like so, and also switch on some background lighting if necessary. Finally, we'll also come down to this central pedestal and switch the backlighting on, which is especially useful right now as it also lights up the CDU buttons, as you can see here. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, next up, we're going to start programming the flight management computers for our flight from San Francisco to LA. However, before jumping back into the CDU, let's configure the payload and the fuel for our flight. The way to do this is again through the EFB we looked at in the previous episode. So let's go into the Fuel, Weight, and Balance tab and head into the Payload section. So click on this payload indication and you'll be brought to this main payload adjustment page. Now, if you want, you can go ahead and enter individual values for each zone of the aircraft. However, we're just going to go ahead and enter our total payload weight using the information from our operational flight plan we looked at in episode 7 of this series. So, under the weights section, we see that our total payload for this flight was around 38,400 pounds. So let's go ahead and enter that in. Next up, let's go back to the main page and select payload again. This time, however, we're going to click on the fuel indication and dial in our total block fuel, which was under the planned fuel section of the OFP. So we're going to go ahead and enter 13,763 pounds like so. Finally, let's go back to the main page one more time, and we're going to select this fuel truck call option, which will bring up the fuel truck and start fueling up the aircraft. You can see this on the outside like so, as well as see the fuel value slowly going up on the bottom right of the upper display unit. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Central Display Unit, or the CDU, located right next to the lower display unit we looked at in episode 6 of this series. Now, I understand that a lot of people get very confused with the complex numbers and figures we need to dial into this system. However, it's actually pretty easy, considering we obtained most of these numbers from our operational flight plan in episode 7, and also because the CDU is almost like an old Nokia flip phone. So obviously, we have the main display in the middle, and on either side we have 6 buttons which allow us to key in important information into various fields located alongside each of these buttons. You'll see what I mean in a second. Underneath the display, at the top, we have a series of shortcut buttons that will take us to important flight information pages on the CDU, such as the route page, the climb and cruise page, the descent page, and so on. In this video, while performing a standard point-to-point flight between two large international airports, we're only going to be using these 9 buttons. On the left here, we also have a numpad, again like one of those Nokia flip phones, and we also have a plus or minus symbol to enter runway slopes or temperature values. On the right of this keypad, we have all of the letters of the English alphabet, as well as these space, delete, backslash, and clear keys at the bottom. Also, at the top of this keypad, we have this execute button, which we will be taking a look at in a second. Finally, beside the execute button, we have this display brightness knob, which allows pilots to adjust the brightness of the CDU. Alright, so with the introduction to this CDU aside, let's go to programming it for our flight. So as you can see, currently the display gives us the option of either jumping into the FMC or flight management computer and start programming our flight, or go into this ACARS page. For those of you who don't know, ACARS stands for Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, and is a digital data link system for transmission of short messages between aircraft and ground stations via airband radio or satellite. In the Zibo mod, we're going to use this ACARS system to obtain the current weather information at our local airport, aka San Francisco. So in order to head into this ACARS page, simply press the button adjacent to this ACARS text on this display. As you can see, we are now in the ACARS menu, so we now have a couple of things we can see here. At the top, of course, we have the title of this menu, which is ACARS menu as I just said, and the number of pages within this menu, so there's only one in this case, and we are, of course, on page 1. On the top left here, we see this ATIS request option. Now for those of you who don't know, ATIS stands for Automatic Terminal Information Service, which is a constant automated voice that is broadcasted on a specific ATC frequency which contains important information such as the current weather conditions, active departure and arrival procedures, as well as cautionary messages such as the presence of birds near the vicinity of the aircraft and so on. So since we need the weather conditions for this airport, we're going to go ahead and click this button right next to this ATIS request indication. As you can see, that brings us to this ATIS request menu. As you can see on the right, we have this airport's message along with these blank boxes below which always signify that you can type something within them. So let's put the ICAO code of the airport we need weather information about, so KSFO, and as you can see, it copies that message onto this scratch pad down here. Now all you need to do is go to and click on the button adjacent to the airport indication and it populates that field with KSFO. Note that this is how we're going to be filling in all of the information in the various fields today. Next up, we're going to go ahead and click on this send button down here to send our request to get weather information at San Francisco. It's going to take a second to get the required information and an ATIS indication will pop up, like so. So line select that and there's the ATIS information for KSFO. Don't worry if it looks a little bit complicated, as we're only going to need this bit of the ATIS information. So reading it from the left, we see the current time in Zulu time. Below that, from left to right, we see the ICAO code of the current airport, the local wind at the airport, in this case 310 degrees at 15 knots, and on the right of the winds, we see the visibility, in this case 10 statute miles, meaning it's a beautiful day to fly. Coming to the second line from the left, we see the cloud status. In this case, we have few clouds at around 900 feet. We also see the temperature, the dew point, as well as our altimeter setting, in this case 29.90 inches of mercury. And that's all we need from the ATIS broadcast under the ACARS tab. So simply press this menu button and you will be brought back to the main menu to select between the FMC and ACARS pages again. Okay, so next up, let's head into this FMC menu, and right off the bat, as you can see, we're brought to this Ident page, which obviously stands for identification. So there isn't really much to fill into this page, however we do need to verify a couple of things. Starting off at the top left, we make sure that the specific model of the aircraft is correct, which is the Boeing 737-800W, or Whiskey in this case. The reason we do this is because Boeing has different proprietary FMS programs that they install into the CDUs of their different aircraft. So we just want to make sure that we don't by any chance have, let's say, the Boeing 747 FMS program installed here instead, but as you can see, we're all good. Next up, we want to make sure that the nav data installed in the aircraft is as needed. This relates back to the ARAC cycle I mentioned in episode 7, so if you have the latest ARAC cycle, you should see that as the active nav data cycle over here. If you don't have the latest ARAC, you'll see the one you do have here, and will also get a message on the scratch pad here saying nav data out of date. Simply clear that by pressing this clear button and you should be good to go. Finally, the last thing we're going to make sure is that the engine rating for this aircraft is 26K. This is again similar to the aircraft model test we performed previously, as this tests the engine model. So in our case, our two CFM56 engines can provide 26,000 pounds of maximum thrust. So once we've verified all of these parameters, we can then head into the next page by pressing the button adjacent to the pause init indication down here. So pause init stands for position initialization, and the main thing we're going to do here is to allow the IRS systems on board to be able to calibrate themselves and provide the correct indications in these displays. So to start off, we'll go ahead and enter the reference airport, in this case our departure airport, which is Kilo Sierra Foxtrot Oscar, or KSFO. Underneath, we'll go ahead and enter the gate we're currently parked at, which is Delta 12 in this case. Finally, over here we see this set IRS position indication with these boxes underneath. So we need the exact GPS coordinates of where we're parked, so as to assist the IRS systems in aligning. Now, we can't really use the coordinates of the airport itself, as you can see over here, as those are the coordinates of the geographic center of the airport, and we're not exactly there. Luckily, if you press this next page button, you'll be taken to this position reference page where we see the two GPS calculated coordinates for our aircraft from the left and right GPS systems respectively. So simply go ahead and line select either one, let's go with the left one for today, and copy it to the scratch pad below. Then we're simply going to head back to the previous page and line select the set IRS position indication, and voila! It fits like a glove. Additionally, if we pan up above, we'll see that the PFD and the ND have also come alive, thereby confirming that the IRS alignment has been performed successfully. Okay, so from the position initialization page, we're now going to head into the route page by clicking on the appropriate button at the bottom right. By now, you should have realized that the FMC is not trying to confuse you or anything. It literally takes you from page to page and asks you to give it information it needs to fly the aircraft properly. So, as you can see, we have a few more fields we need to fill out here. Starting from the top left, we have the origin, where we type the departure airport. Now, the FMC already remembers our reference airport from the previous page, so you may simply line select the origin and KSFO automatically gets inputted into that field. Next up, our destination airport is going to be Los Angeles, so let's put in KLAX into that field like so. Underneath the destination airport, we have our flight number, so we're going to put in Delta 805, or Delta Alpha Lima 805. This co-route indication stands for company route. The premise being that airlines will often fly this route every day and will hence always use the same route. So instead of manually entering every single waypoint and airway every time the pilots fly, they can simply enter in a company route and all the fields will be populated automatically for them. For the instructional purposes of this video, we'll be doing everything manually, so we'll leave that blank. As for the runway, this will get filled up automatically when we enter it in the departure and arrival page. So speaking of the departure and arrival page, let's go into it by pressing this button over here. As you can see, we're brought to this page over here where we can select the departure and arrival parameters of the flight. So let's go over to the top left and select the departure out of San Francisco. So on the left here, we have a long list of SIDs, or Standard Instrument Departures, and on the right, we have a list of all of the runways available at KSFO. So looking at our flight plan, we're going to be taking off from runway 28 right. So let's keep flicking through the pages until we find it. There we go. Happened to be on page 2. Next up, we're going to select our SID, which, as you can see again on the flight plan, is the Westla 4 departure. So again, cycle through the pages till you find it, and then line select it. When you select the SID, you automatically get a new drop-down list of transitions, and as you can see, eBay is right near the top, so we're going to go ahead and select it there. So once we have the departure side of things sorted, we're going to head back to the route page, and as you can see, the runway field here has been populated with 28 right. So to enter our full route, we're going to go to the second page of this route menu, where we have these via and to indications. So the basic rule of thumb here is to enter the airways under the via tab and waypoints under the to tab. So after eBay, we're going to head directly to Reyes, as there's no intermediary airway. When you have no airways, simply type the name of the waypoint and enter it directly under the to category. As you can see, the CDU automatically understands that it's a direct routing. Next up, after Reyes, we're going to join the Juliet 1 airway, so let's enter that under the via section, and we're going to take that all the way to FIM, or Foxtrot India Mike. So that's the end of our route and the start of our arrival procedure into Los Angeles. So next up, we're going to go back to the departure and arrival page, but this time we're going to enter our arrival information into Los Angeles. So go ahead and select the arrivals into Los Angeles. Once again, we're brought to a page similar to the departures page, but instead of SIDs, we now have stars or standard terminal arrivals on the left. So according to our flight plan, our predicted arrival runway is going to be 25 left. So let's select that on the right, and our star is going to be the Sadie 8 arrival, which we can also go ahead and select. Finally, our arrival transition is going to be FIM. So let's go ahead and select that over here. Finally, with the entire route selected, including the departure and arrival procedures, pilots would normally confer with one another and make sure that the information entered is correct. We then press the Activate button, which as you can see illuminates this light above the Execute button. So simply press the Execute button and the route has been saved into the FMS. And so that's that for the navigational aspect of the FMC. Next up, we're going to be configuring the aircraft's performance characteristics, which involves calculating takeoff thrust, programming the cost index, and so on. So the first page we're going to look at is the Perf Init page, which as you can see at the bottom is the next page the CDU is directing us to. So let's click it and we're brought to the Performance Initialization page. Much like the Position Initialization page, we're going to enter some vital information here to allow the aircraft to get an idea of how it's going to fly today. Starting from the top left, we have the gross weight and the cruise center of gravity calculations. This is pretty easy to do in the Zibo mod, as we already entered our fuel and payload into the EFB, so simply line selecting this indication will fill in the gross weight automatically. Additionally, it will also fill in this zero fuel weight indication at the bottom. Now, there is no mention of gross weight in our OFP, but we can check to make sure that the zero fuel weight is within the specific boundaries in our flight plan. As we can see, the zero fuel weight given by the FMC is 133.4, and the flight plan estimates it to be between 130.3 and 138.3, so as long as we're in that range, the calculations hold up. Underneath the gross weight indication, we have our planned and total trip fuel. As you can see, the total fuel is already filled in as 13.8, but we can also enter the planned fuel to get from San Fran to LA to allow the aircraft to understand how much extra fuel we have on board. So we can enter the OFP and enter this trip fuel value as a decimal number, in this case 6.0. Coming down, we have our reserve fuel value, which again we can find in the fuel tab as the FinRes value. So in our case, we're carrying 3,315 pounds of reserve fuel, which can be typed in as 3.3 like so. Underneath, we have the cost index value. Again, referring back to the flight plan, we see that our cost index was 31, so simply come down here and type 31 into this field. Now, I must also mention at this point that if you don't know what FinRes is or what cost index is, go check out episode 7 of this series, where I explain how to read an operational flight plan in detail. So coming to the top right of this menu, we're primarily going to be referring back to the flight log portion of the flight plan, starting with the cruising altitude. On the left here, we see that the aircraft tells us that the optimal cruising altitude for our flight, based on our specified parameters, should be flight level 375, or 37,500 feet. However, as seen on our flight plan, our cruising altitude is going to be flight level 350, so we're just going to come down here and enter 350 or 35,000 or flight level 350, any format will work. As soon as we enter that value in, we get a few more options, and the execute light comes on. So first thing we're going to enter are the cruise winds, which as we can see are found over here. So the winds are coming from a direction of 240 degrees and are at a speed of 48 knots. Finally, underneath the cruise winds, we can go ahead and enter the ISA deviation, which as you can see is plus 10 on the flight plan. So simply go ahead and enter 10. Note that if the ISA deviation value were negative, we would have had to click this button down here to switch to a negative symbol and then enter the chosen value. Finally, we're going to make sure that the transition altitude entered here is also correct. You can verify this using airport charts, and as you can see, 18,000 feet is indeed correct. So once all the values on this page have been entered, verify that they're all correct, and when you're happy, go ahead and push the execute button like we did for the route. So next up, let's head into this N1 limit page, where we will be configuring our total takeoff and climb performance. So before we get started, I think it's important to give you guys a premise behind why configuring thrust performance is so important. As you guys know, in real life, airlines pay a lot of money to be able to maintain their fleet of aircraft, and a large proportion of that money goes towards making sure that the engines are operating at specified safety standards. Although the engines are rated to be used for upwards of a decade or more, there are ways to increase their lifespan, and one such way is to reduce the thrust produced by them during takeoff and climb. Large international airports, such as San Fran or LA, have long runways and departure procedures, so aircrafts don't need to go max throttle and take off as quickly as possible. Instead, they can use a bit more of the runway in exchange for saving wear and tear on the engines. So, on the N1 limit page, we're going to limit the thrust for takeoff, and there are two main methods of doing this, and this process is called derating. Method number 1 is to use a fixed derate. So as we saw on the Ident page, the CFM56 engines installed in this aircraft can provide a maximum thrust of 26,000 pounds, which gives us an N1 value of 98.7%. However, underneath the 26K setting, the aircraft has two other presets providing 24,000 and 22,000 pounds of thrust, which have an N1 value of 94.5% and 92.3%. Now in the sim, you can simply select one of these fixed derates to reduce takeoff thrust, but in real life, pilots will normally also use something called an assumed temperature, which is another value that the pilots will provide the FMC to be able to properly provide the right thrust for takeoff. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail about how to calculate this assumed temperature value, but I'll leave a link to a website down below that will explain what it is and how it's calculated. In the sim, I actually use a tool called AppSoft, which is a free plugin available on the xplane.org forums that does takeoff and landing calculations for you. So, as you can see, upon entering the ICAO code of the departure airport, some weather information, and the predicted takeoff weight, the software spits out values for us. So according to this software, our assumed temperature value is going to be 39 degrees Celsius, and our fixed derate to go along with that will be the lowest 22K derate. So let's go ahead and start inputting the required information into the N1 limit page. So our assumed temperature goes on top here, so let's enter 39 here. Additionally, also verify that the OAT, or outside air temperature reading after the backslash, is correct here. After that, we're going to come down to select the 22K derate for takeoff. As for the right side, make sure that the N1 value is set. Now note that the discrepancy between this N1 value and the one we see here is due to the fact that the passengers, payload, and cargo configuration of the Zibo is a tad bit different to the one used in AppSoft software's rendition of the 737-800. Just go for the one that Zibo gives you, as that's always more reliable. we're also going to make sure that the N1 bugs are set on the upper display unit, which they are, so that confirms that we'll be spinning the engines at approximately 90% of their capacity during the takeoff sequence. This climb derate is similar to the takeoff derate and basically adjusts our rate of climb from the departure airport. There isn't really too much of a need to mess with this setting, so you can leave the climb derate to the first topmost setting over here. And that's that for the N1 limit page. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the final performance page on the FMC, which is the takeoff page. Here, we're going to set a few pretty self-explanatory parameters regarding the takeoff in particular. Referring back to the AppSoft tool, our recommended takeoff flap setting is flap 5, so let's go ahead and enter that in here. Coming underneath, let's again verify that the takeoff derate and N1 are set. So N1 is checked, and the derate is 22K. Coming underneath, we have this CG indication, which stands for Center of Gravity. Now I'm pretty sure that the pilots in real life actually calculate this value, but the Zibo mod just gives it to you if you line select it. So simply go ahead and press this button, and we get both our CG and our stabilizer trim values, which we will set later on in the pre-flight procedure. Next up, on the right of this page, we have our V-speeds. Now, as promised in previous episodes, I'll provide you guys with a brief understanding of what the three important V-speeds are. In essence, V-speeds are standard terms used to define airspeeds that are important or useful to the operation of all aircraft. So in the case of the Boeing 737-800, we have three main ones. V1 is takeoff abort speed. This means that any time before reaching V1 while moving on the runway, the pilots can abort the takeoff safely and apply maximum brakes to come to a stop without overrunning the runway threshold. The pilot flying would normally keep one hand on the control column or yoke while keeping the other hand on the throttles until reaching V1. After the pilot monitoring calls V1, the pilot flying will take his hands off the thrust levers and place both hands on the yoke to be able to pull the control column back for takeoff. That brings us to VR, which is the V-rotate speed. When the pilot monitoring calls rotate, the pilot flying will gently pull the yoke back and apply positive pressure on the yoke to raise the nose wheel of the aircraft and take off. Finally, V2 is just a reference indication and isn't normally called out by anyone in the flight deck. Essentially, V2 is the single engine safe climb speed. So if an engine experiences a failure after crossing V2, the plane can continue its climb safely and vice versa. So calculating these V-speeds in the Zibo mod is pretty simple, but we're going to give the aircraft a little bit more information to give us the most accurate values. So let's head over to the page 2 of the takeoff reference page, and here we're going to enter the runway winds, which is 315 at 15 knots, which we got from the ACARS data in the beginning of the video. Next up, we're going to come down here and enter the runway heading, which can be again found on airport charts. So as you can see, the runway heading for 28 right is 284 degrees. So we're going to come down here and input a backslash and then the runway heading, as that is the format we see here. Now unfortunately, the Zibo 737-800 doesn't allow us to input the runway slope, or we would have done that too. Finally, on this page, we're going to select the runway condition. So we have the option to choose between dry, wet, and skid-resistant runways. We're just going to keep it to dry for now. Finally, we're going to come back to the first takeoff reference page and line select the V-speeds. And there we go. We have our V1, VR, and V2 speeds calculated for us. Finally, on this page, we can also make sure that the predicted takeoff weight is within the boundaries of our flight plan, like we did for our zero fuel weight calculation, and as you can see, it's well within the specified range. So that's that for the takeoff page, and by extension, also the end of the CDU pre-flight procedure. So, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of this Aircrafts Dissected episode, which covered the CDU pre-flight procedure. If you've stuck around so far, congratulations! You now have a sound understanding of how to fully program the flight management computers within the aircraft and get them ready for flight both from a navigational and performance perspective. Now, I must also mention that all of the documentation and websites I used to research for this video are linked down below in the description, including a written text version of this entire video if you prefer to read those and understand more about this aircraft. That being said, the next episode in this series will be the final pre-flight procedure, after which we will start up the engines and get ready for taxi and takeoff. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to perform a full stop landing at the like button and the subscribe button, and press the bell icon for future notifications from this channel. Also, be sure to fly by the comment section and let me know if there's any questions you'd like me to answer for you. As usual, thanks for flying by.